Today, learn the basic formula for calculating your food and beverage costs. Understand the difference between theoretical and actual costs, and discover how to properly account for waste and spillage. Hello, and welcome to the Bar Business Podcast, where we help bar owners increase profits, attract loyal guests, and simplify operations so you can avoid burnout and finally enjoy your life outside of your bar. I'm your host, Chris Schneider, the Bar Business Coach. Before we get started, a quick thank you to our sponsors, Spot On, who provide a great modern POS solution for the bar and restaurant industry, and Starfish, who use AI to turn your books into actionable steps to increase profits. I'm sure many of you have listened to the podcast a lot, and you know I love to talk about food and beverage costs. But oftentimes we're talking about something else and we're just kind of bouncing off of it. So today, I wanted to take just a couple minutes and really hammer in on what is food and beverage cost, how do we measure it, how do we know what's right, and what formulas do you need to know? We're actually going to talk some math today. So the first thing I want to do is talk through some basic formulas. So when we talk food and beverage cost, it is cost divided by sales price times 100. That is your basic equation. Cost percentage equals cost of product divided by sales price times 100. And it's only times 100 because you're turning the decimal into a percentage. So we're really just taking our cost divided by our sales price. Now, what's important to understand here is that for each individual item, yes, cost divided by sales price. For categories, cost divided by sales price, not overall revenue as a percentage, but the actual item. So if your P&L has a line for draft beer, you calculate your draft beer cost by taking the cost of draft beer, dividing it by the sales price of the draft beer that you sold. Seems pretty simple, but you got to be careful because almost all financial software is set up for general businesses. So it'll take your cost divided by total revenue. It'll make your numbers seem way lower. And like QuickBooks does this, if you just say percentages and you throw it on there, and it'll say, oh, my food cost is 10%. I'm the most amazing restaurant ever. No, your food cost is like 30%. You just don't know it. Because you took your cost divided by revenue instead of your cost divided by specifically food revenue. So it's really important. It's a huge distinction that a lot of people miss. And again, be careful when you're using percentages on financial software, because that's not how it's going to calculate it unless it's restaurant specific. The other thing that's important here is there are two components of this equation, cost and price. Now for beer, keg of beer is pretty easy. Keg of beer costs you $200. You're going to get on a 90% yield, which is what I do all my costing for draft beer. I factor in 90% yield. You're going to get basically 108 pints out of a keg. 120 would be full yield, but you don't ever get full yield. So I like to price based on 90% yield and then aim for 95% yield so that my actual and theoretical look just awesome. And we'll talk about actual and theoretical cost here in a second. So beer or, a vodka soda, that's really easy. Vodka soda is basically free. Vodka costs what it costs. Boom, boom, done. Where this gets a lot more complicated, and we've talked about this before, is food or complex cocktails. 5 ingredients, 6 ingredients, 7 ingredients in a cocktail. All of that is part of your cost. Your mixers, your garnishes, all of that needs to be considered in your cost calculation. Because if you don't include that in your cost, what you're going to do is you're going to say, oh, well, I made my theoretical cost on all these items 20%. Yeah, except you didn't count the mixers or the garnish. So you're 20% on the liquor. By the time I add mixers and garnishes and all this other stuff, especially if it's pineapple juice and orange juice and a bunch of expensive juices, well, okay, so my liquor cost in that drink is 20%. The cost of the liquor is 20% of the sales price. But by the time I add all that stuff in, my actual cost is 32%, 34%. So all your ingredients, all your garnishes, everything needs to be factored into that cost. Now, like I said, let's talk a little bit about actual and theoretical cost. So first, let's define these, because I throw these around a lot and I don't always define them. Theoretical cost is what your cost should be based upon perfect portions. So theoretical cost, you use your PMIC, you know the cost to make each item, and you sold 30 Budweisers, and each Budweiser costs $1. So it's $30 a cost, $1 per unit. That's simple. Again, we get into food and complex cocktails. It gets a lot more complex than that. And theoretical cost is just understanding what your cost should be based upon what you have sold. If everything was poured properly, if every standard was followed. Now, obviously, that doesn't happen in the real world. So then we have actual cost. The real cost of everything, including your waste and loss. Now, what does actual cost look like? How do we calculate actual cost? Well, you can't know cost just by inputting numbers from invoices. You might be kind of close, but you could be way off. Because that's what you purchased, not what you used. Real cost is what you used. Real cost is cost of goods sold. What is our cost of goods sold equation? Cost of goods sold, beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory equals cost of goods sold. Beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory equals cost of goods sold. So we're not looking at the PMX. We're counting everything we have and saying, what does this cost, right? If I had $15,000 worth of inventory at the start of the week and at the end of the week I have $10,000 worth of inventory, I used $5,000 of cost. Actual, theoretical, it's based on your PMix, it's based on your theoretical calculations. Actual is just your cost of goods sold, beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory. That is your actual cost week to week. Now, why do we need to know both theoretical and actual? Because you need to reconcile one against the other, particularly because, you know what, especially when it comes to food, but also when it comes to booze, and particularly wine, saying, well, my standard food cost is 35%, let's just say, right? But maybe people ordered a bunch of high-cost food items or low-cost food items. Your PMix actually has to be involved here to understand your theoretical. Then you take your actual, this is what I actually did, and then we look at what is the difference between these two numbers. In a perfect world, the difference between those two numbers is less than 2%. 2% is, in my mind, where I red flag that variance. You're always going to have some variance between actual and theoretical, especially if you're doing something like free pouring, right? I don't care if I have a bartender that can free pour an ounce and a half, and an ounce and a half is my standard drink, and they can free pour that every day perfectly. When you're working, when you're slinging drinks, some are going to be a little heavy, some are going to be a little light. That is what it is. But you need to understand some variance will always exist. To me, that's a 2% allowable, but that actual versus theoretical should be under 2%. If it's more than 2%, you have a problem and you need to go figure out what the heck happened. Why have you spent way more money than you should have? Or why have you spent way less money than you should have? Is everybody pouring light? Are your customers not getting the product they should be getting? Is that why it's cheaper? Because a lot of times in this industry, we see a high cost number and we go, oh no, I got to bring that down. We see a number that's too low compared to theoretical. And we go, oh, that's awesome. I saved money this week. Yeah, but something suffered. Something is wrong. Any variance, whether in your favor or not in your favor, between actual and theoretical, over 2%, you need to figure out why and stop that. Now, a couple things here to implement and actually have good cost control in your business. Number one is regular inventory. You need to do a full inventory every week, not every week, every month, to at least get that actual number on a monthly basis. I like to do it every week because then every week I can look at actual, theoretical. I know where I should be. I know what's happened. I know if I'm wrong or not. I say do inventory every week. Obviously, none of this works unless you have standardized recipes, standardized portions, standardized pours. Everything must be standardized down to the penny. Otherwise, you can't calculate actual and theoretical right. When I say standardized down to the penny, I mean, what are your portions? How big are they? What are your garnishes? All of that needs to be standardized. And the other thing that you really need to keep control of your cost is a waste log. You need to understand what got wasted. Why did it get wasted? And then fix that in the future so things don't get wasted. So understanding and tracking your food and beverage cost is like the most essential thing. Literally the most essential thing to maintaining a profitable operation. Really, when it comes to cost, it needs to be all about the math, because the math on the cost, the math on your pricing is what gives you a margin that puts food on your table as an owner. If you implement basic calculations and cost controls, you can ensure a profit or a pricing structure that supports healthy profits. That about wraps it up for today. If you enjoyed today's insights, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you are ready to take your bar to the next level, schedule a strategy session with me by clicking the link in the show notes below. Until next time, have a great day, and we will talk again later.